Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm Temple, president of Hartford College, and I want to welcome everyone here. I see we have a lot of people from the community, and I understand we also have some students from Bryn Mawr College. How did I pick you out? I don't know. But at any rate, welcome. We're glad that you were able to make it over as well. We're very excited about this third lecture in our centennial series. We have more lectures coming up. That's the infomercial part of my presentation. But we do have more coming up, and they are free to you. So, please join us again. We publicize it, and we would love to have you here. I am going to just be very short because Terry Grudy, who's our director of continuing studies, is going to introduce Dr. Fuentes. But we did have lunch with him today, and he is very fascinating, and he has a great message. So now he has to just live up to that, and we'll be all set. He's going to explain to you why the Notre Dame girls didn't win the national championship. They lost to Kentucky, and then we'll go from there. But anyhow, I'm going to turn it over to Terry Grudy, and again, welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you, Dr. Temple. I'm just going to read from my notes because I have a couple pages, so you'll excuse me. So we're delighted to have you all here today for Race is Not Biology and Other Myths About Human Nature, presented by Dr. Fuentes, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. So I'm going to copy Dr. Temple and warmly welcome so many groups. First, the students at Harcum, raise your hands so we can see who everyone is. Faculty and staff of Harcum, so everybody's, wow, that's a lot of representatives. Alumni, also represented, board members, and community guests. So what an eclectic group of people. So we're really happy and excited to have this kick off. It's exciting to see all of you, so welcome. And Bryn Mawr College, we also welcome you too, who have been studying his book in your class, is what we hear. So that's really exciting too. So I guess you have that already over there. So following the presentation, just some logistics for those of you who don't know where the restrooms are, right where you walked in and registered. Not that you need it around here that long, but if you do, they're through three sets of double doors together on your signs to do that. Following the presentation, there'll be a formal question and answer period and a drawing for door prizes if you registered for that, as well as a book signing. So now on to our speaker. When Steve Jobs said the only way to do great work is to love what you do, he could have been referring to Dr. Fuentes, an esteemed academic who teaches, lectures, and coaches other academics. He's also an author, a TED talker, which members of the committee have researched him and done our homework, and really exciting, so Google him and you'll be really entertained, as well as a Huffington Post blogger. Once an interviewer asked Dr. Fuentes what he is most passionate about in life: work, anthropology, society, science, or play. His answer, all of it, simultaneously. To be honest, he continued, I have trouble differentiating between these categories. For me, anthropology crosses all of these categories, so I'm always an anthropologist, whether I want to be or not. He was greatly influenced by a course he took as an undergrad in primate behavior. His professor began lecturing about chimpanzees and langurs and proceeded to describe a day in the life of these primates, and he was hooked. He believes that anthropology has much to say, especially in order to counter much of the prevailing common sense and societal myths in this country, especially related to race, gender, and aggression. Academia and knowledge must have something to do with our lives, he said. Please welcome our very special presenter, Dr. Agustin Fuentes.
Let's see. Let me make sure. Plug this in. How's that? Good. You guys hear me fine? Is that good? Good? Okay. So, let me set the stage here to start with. Everything I'm going to be talking about today, sort of human nature, race, sex, aggression. So, if I was going to do this really well, we'd be sitting here for the next 6 to 9 years. Not going to do that to you. I'm going to try in the next 45 or 50 minutes to run through an enormous amount of data, of information, and of context. So I'm going to talk fast, and I'm going to run through a bunch of pictures. Please, if you have questions, please ask them. Ask them in the Q&A section. And if something happens when I'm up here talking, before the Q&A session happens, and you just have no idea what I'm talking about, or think I'm just way off base, just yell it out. We'll do it. All right, human nature. Is there a human nature, right? Most people like to think there is. Is it instinct, right? Is there innate? Is there something inside us that makes us who we are? Is human nature who we really are, and then there's just a sort of covering of culture on top of us? What about genes, biology, right? Don't our DNA, aren't they the blueprints of our lives, who we are? What about culture? Doesn't culture inform us? Aren't we constructed from day one by our culture? The answer to all of this is sort of yes and no. Is there something that we could call a common human nature by which we can recognize each other as human beings? Is there something that mixes all of this stuff together? Yes, yes there is, but it's not what you think. First of all, it's absurdly complicated. And I'm going to try to make a little sense of it here today. The problem with talking about human nature is that there are many successful ways to be human. If you travel around the world, I've traveled to lots of places, you will be shocked at how diverse we are in how we look, how we act, how we make a living. But you will also be shocked at how similar we are in being human. All right, so one of the biggest problems in talking about human nature is actually this thing that we think of as human nature. I'm going to call these myths. Myths are, it's not the myth of Icarus who flew too close to the sun, or the myth that if you put a tooth in a can of Coke overnight, it'll dissolve. Those are, one is a sort of a historical thing, the other thing is scientifically wrong. You can demonstrate that by putting a tooth in Coke. The problem is there's a lot of common myths, sort of what we call common sense. We grow up in a society, we believe certain things, we're taught certain things, and these things are sort of natural, so they're right. They're common sense, so we understand them, and we have this concept of nature versus nurture, that there's this sort of natural right thing inside us, and then there's other stuff that you're raised in different ways and that messes with it. Well, let me point out that these are all wrong. It doesn't work that way. And I'm going to show you with 3 very specific examples. If we believe that natural, whatever we think that is, via our common sense is right, and that nature is something underlying nurture, and that nature sort of drives us forward, that impacts our expectations, and it impacts the way in which we relate to people. And I'm going to point out what you do already know, but may not think about all the time, that what we think about race, what we think about sex, and what we think about aggression actually impacts what we expect of other human beings and the way we act with them. So if these things are myths, certain myths, are structuring the way we relate to one another, we need to bust those myths because they're causing problems, they're inhibiting human flourishing, and they're making it difficult for us to build better communities in our lives. So here are the big 3. There are many more myths, but I'm going to stick with these. Race. Humans are divided into biological races. Okay, that is, black, white, Asian, Latino are real biological things. Okay, that's not true. That doesn't mean at all that race is not important and not very real. I'm going to try to show you how those 2 seemingly contradictory things can happen. Aggression, that if we remove all the cultural constraints, if we tear aside culture and all these things that inhibit us, we tear away Dr. Jekyll and reveal Mr. Hyde. Right? There's this beast inside us, especially with men, right? That if you don't control them, they're going to go crazy. And that aggression is sort of this natural go-to resource for humans. And finally, sex, that men and women are really from 2 different planets. That they're so different that it's really hard to imagine them the same species. All of these things are common beliefs and myths, and they are all incorrect. And I'm going to really quickly, a little bit more with race, and a little bit less with these 2 just because of time, I'm going to run through data, information, knowledge that bust these myths, and then we're going to talk about why that's important. All right, so let me just start with a line here. Many people use the phrase, ignorance is bliss. Now, what's funny is this is actually from a poem, right, about an English, very famous English school, and they don't read the whole poem, so they just use this one line, ignorance is bliss, and they're usually ignorant of where that line comes from. But ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is just ignorance. And ignorance is not good. We are the largest brained primate out there. Our brain is unbelievably capable to deprive it of its nutrition is a problem. So what we're going to do is bust that. We're going to break up a little bit of ignorance today. All right. So again, the big three, just to remind you, this is where we're going, because now I'm going to start talking really fast and running through a bunch of stuff. Race is biological or natural. Humans are aggressive by nature. Men and women are really, really, really naturally different. Now, you may say, well, these are, you're just making this up. You're setting up straw men. Step back for a moment. Tell me this isn't what most people think. Tell me this isn't what most people think. And tell me what this isn't what most people think. This is how we think. And I'm not saying this is good or bad. It is the way it is right now. These are myths that are prominent. Let's look at them. All right. What race is and what it is not. Let's see how fast I can get through this. Race is both biologically and socially constructed. Okay? So there is one biological race in humans. There's actually a definition, a biological way in which we can calculate race, not just in humans, but in all mammals, all organisms, fish, birds, humans. We can actually talk about this as a zoologist might. Given that definition, there's currently one race in humans, and there has been for a long time. Now, a whole other talk, we can talk about Neanderthals and humans and other things. There might have been more than one race of humans. There's only one now. But there are socially constructed races. In our society, it's black, white, Asian, Latino. In other societies, it's different ways of dividing humans up. All societies divide people up. All societies make a big deal about that. Okay? So race is real. It's just not the biological race that we think it is. Let me just point out, because I give this talk sometimes and it says, oh, you're just trying to say everyone is the same. I am not trying to say everyone's the same. Look around the room. I would be an idiot to try to convince you everyone is the same. Everyone is different. In fact, humans are enormously biologically variable. But all of that biological variation is not divided up into races. Humans are all biopsychologically equal. This is actually the only way I'll say humans are equal. That is, if you take an infant from any society anywhere on the planet, take that infant at birth, well, actually don't do this, it's highly risky. But if you take an infant, at birth, and take that infant to another society and raise it, it acquires that other society perfectly. All humans have equal capacity to be human. That's where we're equal. Everywhere else we vary. Okay, so keep that in mind. I'm not just trying to say we're all the same by any stretch of imagination. If you believe race is biology, if you believe, as a bunch of stats I'm going to show you about racial inequality here in the United States, if you believe this is natural and this is part of our body and part of the way we evolved, then you're going to give up and you're going to leave that inequality, inequity, and injustice because it's natural. It's not. It's cultural, it's historical, it's economic, it's political, but it's real. All right. I encourage you to look at the American Anthropology Association Race Project, a great online and touring museum exhibit where a lot of this stuff is dealt with. All right, so race. What do we know about race, and does biology show us race? If we look at what we know about human biology, can we get race? All right, let's ask the question. So, everyone knows this. Now, I show this all the time, like, this is the way we generally think about race, right? Now, people are like, oh, I don't think about that race this way. Lie. You're lying. Think about this. So generally we have this sort of concept, there's sort of this like African group, right? Sort of a European group, sort of Asian, I don't know, Native American, whatever, we sort of throw together, and just ignore Australia because that messes everything up. So we ignore that, right? Is this unfamiliar to anyone? Okay, so this is the way we used to think of it, sort of the big three, Asian, African, and European. All right. Let's talk biology. Is there any way we can get this Asian, African, European cluster? What about blood? Everyone knows blood is important, right? If you lose a lot of it, you die. And so for centuries, people have been trying to look to blood to find the races. This is actually where some of the original research on blood type variation came from. So we have actually, there's about 28 different blood types. We're really interested in the ABO one because it's really important. If you miss up, exchanging blood, it can kill you. The ABO comes in three sort of genetic versions, O, A, and B. Actually, I'm lying. There's two versions of A, but that's complicated, so we'll ignore that. So O, A, and B, and O is most common. A and B are a little bit less common. So, does blood give us race? All right. So here's the distribution of B, right, around the planet. And yeah, wow, look, it varies. So obviously, these people here in Central Africa, the Australians, and these Sami reindeer herders are obviously the same race, right? Because they share the same blood type. Okay, that was a joke, though. I'm not serious. No, they're not. Do you see any black, white, and Asian here? Is there a pattern? No. Okay, B doesn't give us a pattern. A doesn't give us a pattern. O doesn't give us a pattern. Okay, so blood groups, you can look at any way you want to look at them, any way you want to mix them, they do not give you black, white, and Asian. Not at all, not even close. All right, about genes, well, we've got to do genes, right? Genetics, that'll tell us everything. So here's something, let me break a little ignorance, maybe for some of you, maybe you guys already know this. Do you know all humans have 100% of the same genes? You guys start looking at me, what are you talking about? All humans have 100% of the same genes because we're humans. Now let me point something out. If you look at all of our DNA, so what we have different is each gene has multiple forms. So some genes have 2 forms, some genes have 140 forms. And it's those different forms of genes that vary in human populations. So this shouldn't be surprising because if you were to look at something like, what's this?
An ape?
Chimpanzee, right? It's a chimpanzee. Okay, how much of our overall DNA do we share identically with this? 90. Yeah, I mean, it's almost 100%, so it's like 96, 97%, something like that. So if we share 97% of our DNA with a chimp, it's not surprising that we share a little bit more with humans. I'm just going to throw this in. What's this? There's a little bit of science education here. We share 37% of our DNA with a daffodil, right? Okay, it also shows you how little most people know about DNA. Which part? Is it my leg that's daffodil? No, so, I mean, the bottom line is it's not surprising at all that all humans have the same genes. It's just that the different types of those genes. The types vary, not the genes. So all humans have the same genes, but the types, all these alleles, vary. All right, and what does that look like? Don't freak out. There's no test or anything after this. Here are 4 genes that come in different forms. Here's the Alu gene. This is one of the few genes that we have that chimps don't. Comes in 2 forms, right? The yellow and green form here. And these are, you can't read it, but each of these is a different human population here, sample. And so you see in some populations there's a lot of the yellow form, a little bit of the green form. In other populations, a lot of the green form, a little bit of the yellow form. Everyone see that? Here's one with like 8 forms or so you get even more variation. This is what human genetic variation looks like. Okay, we all have the same genes, but it's the sort of versions of those genes that vary. Okay, you guys all with me here? Am I getting this? All right. So, we need to ask the question, does this genetic variation, even if we all have the same genes, does this genetic variation of the alleles or forms of genes get us race? Okay, well, I'm giving you the big 3 or the big 5, right? Let's just ignore Native Americans for a moment. Here's Europe, here's Africa, here's Asia, and we'll just ignore there too. But let's just say the big 3 were here. If you were to take some spit and put in a little thing and send it off to 23andMe, right, you get your genetic ancestry. And they'll tell you, hey, wow, we compared these populations. Here we compared some people from Lagos, Nigeria, from London, England, and from Beijing, China, and we can tell them apart genetically. You can. This is true. There's patterns in those forms of genes that you can tell apart. So you can tell apart folks from Lagos, Nigeria, from London, and from Beijing apart. But wait, don't order yet. Let's take 3 Asian populations from these 3 very disparate areas. You can tell them apart by their frequencies of the versions of genes just as easily as those other 3. You can do the same for all of these populations characterized as white or European. And what's most interesting is if you took 3 disparate populations in Africa, the differences are even larger. There's more genetic difference between populations in Africa than between any other populations. Anyone says, well, what? How can that be? I'm going to get to that in a moment. So, remember I said there's a zoological way to define subspecies? So I'm not going to do the math or anything like that. Let me point out that you can measure those differences between populations within a species, and if they reach a certain level, let's say 0.25 or 0.3, that is, if most of the variation is between these populations as opposed to among them, shared, then we could call this a subspecies, which means race. For example, if you were to take Western chimpanzees and central chimpanzees, you get a pretty high FST, well over this number. These are actually considered to be 2 different subspecies. Okay? Average human FST globally is less than half that. So 2 chimpanzees from Africa are more different genetically from one another than any other 2 humans on the planet. But wait, I'll give you one better. White-tailed, you guys know what white-tailed deer are? You see a little white-tail running around?
Yeah.
So, white-tailed deer from here and white-tailed deer from Michigan have more genetic differences on average between those 2 populations than any 2 human beings on the planet. That's how similar humans are genetically. We have huge variation, just that variation is shared across all of us rather than isolated populations. Okay, There are no white, there are no black, there are no Asian genes. There's not a single genetic element that can be uniquely classified to those clusters. DNA does not get us this. This is not what human genetic variation looks like. It's not there's not one sort of European gene pool, African and Asian, and they overlap, but they are sort of identifiable. You can't do this because this is what, if you took all human genetic variation together and put it in a pile and divided it up with these 3 circles, this is what it would look like. 99.99% of all human variation is found within African populations. All the variation of people who live outside of Africa is a subset of African variation. You should be saying, whoa. Most people don't know this for a couple very important reasons. They don't actually teach this stuff in K-12 education like they should. It turns out that humans have been in Africa longer than anywhere else. So we've been there longer, right? Been able to diversify more there. And here's one of the things. You guys might notice this map looks funny to you, right? Okay, this is an accurate projection. The Mercator projection that you all have on your wall or are used to is a horrible map projection. It's actually wrong. You know, there's no way that Alaska is bigger than China in most cases. Okay, so humans have been in Africa longer, and Africa is a lot bigger than you think. You could fit US, India, Argentina, Western Europe, Norway, and China in Africa and still have room left over. So Africa is one of the largest, most densest places and where humans have been the longest. That's why there's more genetic variety in Africa than anywhere else. Okay. So genes don't get us that, blood doesn't get us that. Well, we're getting a little frustrated here, but wait. What do we use in this society? We don't look at genes, we don't look at blood, we look at skin. All right, we look at skin. I can tell what race that person is just by looking at it. All right, so let's talk about skin. Skin is really cool. So here's a cross-section of your and my skin. So it's got a bunch of different layers. What we're really interested in this upper layer here, the epidermis. And the epidermis is just under the epidermis is a bunch of these little organelles called melanocytes. Melanocytes are little things in your skin that produce melanin, right? Melanin is what gives human skin its, well, we say color, but it's actually reflectance. So there's actually 36 grades of reflectance on your skin, and it's just how much light bounces or is absorbed. So if you have a high reflectance, so white light bounces off you, your skin is what? Lighter. Lighter. If it absorbs a lot of light, that is the white light doesn't bounce off, your skin is darker. Okay? We got that? All right, so what melanocytes do is produce the melanin, which is the pigment in your skin. Melanin comes in 2 colors. Which 2 colors? Black and brown. That's it. There's a little keratin too, this little orangey coloration, but that's a separate thing. So you got black and brown here, you've got melanocytes. So that's the way it works. And if you look around the planet, so well, let me go back here. If your melanocytes, so humans vary, I told you humans have biological variation. Humans vary in the way in which melanocytes are distributed in the skin and the rate at which, or sort of the activity at which they produce melanin. Okay? So if your melanocytes are evenly distributed in your skin and they produce a lot of melanin, you absorb a lot of white light. And your skin is darker. If your melanocytes are clumped and sporadically produce melanin, you reflect a lot of light and your skin is white. Okay. If you look at indigenous populations around the planet, those populations have been in the same place for a long time. We want to know that because we want to see sort of what's continuous in humans. You see something really interesting. Darker populations, that is, melanocytes that are evenly distributed, that produce a lot of melanin, are more distributed around the equator than in the northern latitudes, right? And in the southern too. Although what's the problem with the southern is we don't have actually much land in the south, so humans can't live there. Okay, does anyone see that? Mm-hmm. Now, compare that with the incidence of ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light is carcinogenic, and it will mess you up. Your protection as a human against ultraviolet light, because we don't have fur, is in fact melanin. Melanin protects you against ultraviolet light. So the more evenly distributed and sort of dense your melanin layer is, the better protection you have against ultraviolet light. But there's a drawback. You need a little teeny bit of ultraviolet light to help you synthesize vitamin D and a few other things. So if you go very far north, you are under UV lighted. And so if you have dark skin very far north, it is problematic to get enough UV light. Okay. So it turns out that human evolution over time has favored evenly distributed melanin, even distributed melanocytes that produce a lot of melanin in and around equatorial regions, and a selection against that so that you get a change in that as you move farther north. Okay? So, does that give us race? No, that's not giving us race. Skin color tells you a lot about the equator, right? Okay. Let's put everything I've said on the back seat here for a moment. Because let's be honest. One of these things is not like the other. This is in fact me, a long, long, long time ago. And these are 3 young children in a village that I was working in. So, in spite of all I've said, there's still something else we really got to deal with. First of all, we can just look at these individuals and we can sort of tell where they're from. And that's important. So, for example, where's this guy from? What's his ancestry? Yeah, sort of Western European ancestry for the most part. And what about these kids? Yeah, I mean, look at the curly hair, broad noses, dark skin. Africa, right? Wrong. They're Asian. These kids are from New Guinea. You just made the big, ignorant mistake humans make all the time. We think we know what humans look like around the planet, and we do, but you're never exposed to that. These kids are Asian. They have nothing to do with African populations at all. There are dark, tightly curled hair, broad-nosed peoples throughout parts of Asia, throughout parts of Africa, because that's where this kind of ecological pressures are. Skin color tells you nothing about people aside from the relative ancestry near to the equator. They don't tell you black, they don't tell you European, they don't tell you Asian. And they don't even always tell you this. Let me introduce you to Lucy and Maria Aylmer. Lucy and Maria are twins.
Wow.
These 2 little girls are twins. Here's Dad and Mom. Here's Lucy and Maria. So you guys think you know what color and biology means. You don't. We're not taught the flexibility of human diversity and human variation. Here's the family. Same family. Maria and Lucy. Twins.
Paternal or
No, they're fraternal twins. But, I mean, that's what people always say, like, oh, well, of course. Like, no, not of course. I mean, the thing is that these are 2 individuals from the same mother and father. What does skin color really mean? All right, the way we use race is not biology. The way we think about race, black, white, other, all of that stuff, it is not biology. There is no gene for race. Period. End of story. But race is real. Now, you guys are being very polite. When I show this, people laugh all the time. This slide, anyone know what this is? So, why do people laugh when I show this slide?
Stereotypes.
Right, look, there's an Asian guy who's tall, and there's a black guy who's short. What? So first of all, go to Asia, particularly Mongolia, and you'll see some of the tallest people on the planet. Travel all over Africa, and you will see a lot of really short people. We assume we know the biology of race, and we don't. We just demonstrated that. But, regardless, race is real. Okay, I've been sort of funny and laughing about stuff and showing you this biology, but this is not funny. Race is a combination of ethnicity, experience, history, biology, social history, political context, health, physiology, economics, all of that stuff goes together to create what we mean when we say black, white, Asian, Latino. It's real, and it matters a lot. And let me show you how it matters. So, for example, if you try to rent a house and you're black or Hispanic, you get discriminated against relative to whites about 25% of the time. And these tests are done by all men or women, same clothes, same background check, same everything going up to the door and get discriminated against. Usual full-time wage and salary for workers varies by race. Infant mortality rate is twice for blacks what it is for whites in the United States. We are on Amnesty International's list for some of the worst inequality in birth mortality every year. Okay? There's differences in income, differences in health insurance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, Asian, white, Hispanic, black makes a difference in median household income, makes a difference in age-adjusted death rates, and makes a difference in all of these social contexts. It makes a difference in doctors. Doctors, whether black or white or Asian, have negative judgments about black patients versus all other races. Even when whites and blacks are sent to bargain for a used car, blacks are differentiated in initial prices by getting offered higher prices. There's a bunch of studies about Craigslist and response. There's a whole bunch of studies about email sending, but here's my favorite one. eBay auctions. When iPods were auctioned on eBay, researchers randomly varied the skin color of the hand holding the iPod, and a white hand holding the iPod received 21% more offers than a black hand holding the iPod. Racism is real. It matters every day in every way, and anyone who says it doesn't is lying and ignorant. So, the big so what here is that we just showed that race is not biology. Race, as we use the term and classification, is not a reflection of biological groups. Therefore, the differences that we see, these real differences that are a problem for our society, they are not caused by inherent biological differences. They are due to social, historical, political, economic, and experiential contexts. And thus, they're changing. Inequality is not fixed, it's not natural, it's not biological, it's malleable. Race is equal biology? No. Busted. Next minute. Okay. Aggression. Here we go. I got 20 minutes. I'll do it all. 23. So, no one doubts that humans can be unbelievably aggressive, right? There's a famous Dos de Mayo painting by Goya where the Napoleon's troops are slaughtering the citizens of Madrid after an uprising. We know aggression and violence are really important parts of being human, but are they really at our nature? Are they what humans do? Are they our go-to? All right, so we think that humans, in many cases, are naturally that violence and sex is sort of inherent. We think that competition is central to the human experience, right? People think competition is human is inherently violent, at least males, and competition between males for females is one of the main reasons for violence. So, people love Fight Club. Right? Does anyone you guys all seen Fight Club? Everyone loves this guys, right? It's just like two rams hitting their heads together, right? It's what guys do. Guys are violent, they fight, women love it, they go for it, right? All right. Here's a headline that we wouldn't even blink at. 4 killed today in New York City, right? If you guys read that headline, you'd be like, whatever, no big deal. You'd expect that, right? Here's the headline that we never see is actually a lot more important. 8,299,906 people got along today. You want to be really impressed with humans? Walk down Fifth Avenue, and try not to kill people. It's easy. What is amazing is how humans cooperate. Human cooperation, collaboration, and compassion is much more common, much more important, and much more of a go-to for humans. I'm not saying humans don't kill each other. I'm not saying we're not horribly violent and cruel sometimes. But that is actually more typical than that. All right. There's an alternative view of human evolution and who we are. Competition and cooperation are both central. We're wired to be social. And like I said, in the Q&A, we can go into much more detail. I'll just give you a few examples here. Cooperation is more common than conflict. And violence is not inherent, but it's potential, right? Which is a big difference. All right. So, most people like to think that there's some hardwiredness for aggression. And one of the favorite examples of that is MAOA, the warrior gene. You guys ever heard of this, the warrior gene? It's like some guys who have a warrior gene are just impulsive and they fight and they go crazy and want to kill people. And that this has been selected over evolutionary history because humans had to fight and hunt and guys had to go out and kill a mastodon and bring it back to the cave so the woman could cook it up, right? Hey, you laugh, but is that far from the truth? Okay, imagine in your past. Imagine human ancestors making stone tools. Everyone imagine that right now. What gender are the people who just imagine making stone tools?
Men.
We'll come back to that in a moment. All right, the warrior gene. So it turns out there's this argument that there's some sort of biology, neurobiology and neuroendocrinology of violence and aggression, that it's in our genes. There's a way to do that. So I actually worked with a group of researchers. There was a focus of this National Geographic special called Born to Rage, and it was hosted by Henry Rollins. I don't know if you guys know him. Former head frontman for Black Flag, a punk band, and a spoken word artist. He's sort of an angry guy. And he was really interested in knowing, is his anger tied to it? Does he have the warrior gene? Is he aggressive? So they followed Henry around where he interviewed a bunch of Buddhist monks on one hand, and then biker gangs and ultimate fighters and a whole bunch of people who were very, very, very aggressive. So they interviewed a bunch of very mellow people and very aggressive people. And all of us who worked on it, the scientists, the researchers, the host and all the people interviewed, we all got genotyped. We all gave our spit and had them sort of assess us so that we could do this comparison. So there's me, there was him, and so just to sort of point out, there are some real complexities here. Let's just make a wild guess. Who's got the warrior gene? It was me and 2 of the Buddhist monks. So unless you want to change the name of this gene, this form of the gene, to the sort of happy academic or monk hangout, like generally nice guy gene, that's not going to sell. National Geo would never have made that special. No, this gene doesn't have anything to do. It actually has to do with a very, very complex system of serotonin uptake and has some other connections. But it is not warrior gene. There's no human biological system for there's no human biological system for aggression. We co-opt many, many systems for aggression, but there's actually some neuroendocrinological systems that reinforce cooperation. All right, well, okay. So maybe we can find something there, but in our evolutionary history, right, can't we look at all the 4 primates? Can we look at all the primates, and they can help us understand why humans are so violent, right, why we're aggressive, especially males. I mean, look at this male, right? Large testes, big teeth, he's ready to fight. So let's look at all the other primates, right, especially chimpanzees and others. We look around, what do we see in the other primates? Well, interestingly, interspecies violence, that is violence within any given species resulting in death, is extremely rare in almost all mammals. Happens, but it's extremely rare. Most of what we see are frequency of aggression, but very low rates of severity of aggression. So there's fights, there's conflicts. Sometimes they're bad, but it's quite rare. Almost all the time, what we see is this. What are they doing? They're hanging out, grooming, interacting, making strong, affiliative, pro-social bonds. They fight a lot, but they get along more. So, study of non-human primates doesn't give us this sort of primate trend or pattern of aggression. It gives us a big, broad template showing that affiliation, cooperation, and competition and aggression are all tied together and mixed up. What about the past? We can look at our genus Homo. We're now Homo sapiens, we're the most recent species. We can look at the past, and we can look at the last 6 million years, and there is a collection of just over 5,000 skeletal remains. And we can look at all those remains, as a couple of my colleagues have done, and ask the question, well, how many of the remains give us evidence of interpersonal violence in the past? Very few. Not that people didn't fight, not that they didn't hit each other on the head with a club every now and then, but they didn't do it nearly as much as we pretend to think they did. So from about 6 million to 20,000 years ago, there's very few examples of possible death due to other human and none of group violence. But in the last 12,000 years, that changes. And we get a lot more aggression, coordination, and violence. Okay, so if we look at that, and this is a much longer thing that I don't have time to go into, but if you look at the last 2 million to 14,000 years ago, less than 1% of our samples seem to have interpersonal violence or aggression as the cause of death. But in the last 14,000 years, it goes up dramatically. So something's been happening in the last 14,000 years. Not going to go into the discussion much, but it has a lot to do with agriculture, cities, towns, inequality. All right. But even in the last 14,000 years, when you find things like this at Jebel Sabaha, where you get some real good examples of interpersonal violence, you can't see very well, but these are all arrowheads embedded. These are pencils pointing out arrow tips embedded in these bodies. This is violence, right? We can see it in the archaeological record. Right? This is 12,000 years old. There's people who were shot with arrows and died a horrible death. So we find this a lot more in the last 14,000 years. But you know what's much more common in the archaeological record? This. This is an adult female and 2 children, all of who probably died of an infection, a disease, and they're buried with their hands intertwined, facing one. Humans have evolved an unbelievably complex neuroendocrinological system that facilitates cooperation and collaboration. Now, let me point out, what's the worst sort of examples of violence you can think about on a large scale? What do we call it? Genocide or war. What do you need to be any good at war? Cooperation. Those who cooperate better, who are willing to sacrifice for their brothers and families, those are the ones who do better at war. So in fact, our great ability to cooperation has sort of come back to bite us in the butt. We're really good at organizing for killing. But humans are not naturally aggressive. We're not natural aggressors. Our nature is not to be violent. There's no beast within, just lots of complexities and possibilities. So, aggression by nature, nope, busted. Okay, on to the next one, sex. All right, sex. Men are not from Mars and women are not. I'm going to the punchline right here. We belong to the same species, right? Now, it's sort of funny because people are like, well, we're so different. Okay. Let's talk about difference and let's talk about similarity. All right, so here's the evolutionary assumption. I'll let you start this for a moment. Thank you. I put this up before, people are like, well, I don't get it. So there's this assumption that we know what women want, right? Sort of caring, nurturing. We know what men want, sex, and fighting, according to the previous question. So we can just look at the fossil record and sort of what do we see from the fossil record? Actually, not much. We can't really tell much. What we do know is that, and you can't see this very much, but real sex differences in behavior in the paleoanthropological record is almost non-existent. We can't tell one way or another. There might have been great sex differences. There might have been small sex differences. We don't have much evidence, aside from some body size difference that I'll go into here. However, starting at about 15 to 20,000 years ago, we start to see gender in the record. Around the same time we start to see real aggression and warfare, we also start to see clear gender differences, different ways in which the bodies of males and females are reflecting gender differentiation. Not that it didn't happen before that, it probably did, but the patterns of today start fairly recently in an evolutionary context. Let me also just give you one other very important little note, and that is, you guys remember these cave paintings? I gave you that sort of stone tool. So there's no evidence in any indication of older stone tool use up until about 10,000 years ago of either males or females making stone tools. None. We don't know. So all of those paintings, that's called gender reinforcement, also called lying. All those, when we see people doing stone tools, it's always men. Let me give you one example. We have recently have you guys seen those cave paintings? Well, a lot of the early cave paintings and throughout them have these handprints, right, where people chew berries and sort of, they're amazing, really impressive. For the last 40,000 years, you've been seeing these amazing handprints on cave walls. So someone actually went out, it was actually a forensic anthropologist, went out and looked at all of those handprints. And you can measure, and actually there's a biological difference between males and females in hand structure and size. You can measure them and assess them by sex. 70% of the extant handprints that we've studied were made by females and children. I'm just saying, let's use the data. That doesn't mean that women did all the art. But it does mean that our assumptions about men doing the art, which every single reconstruction I've ever seen, those had guys down in the cave painting. And maybe a woman in the back kneeling down. All right, but there are differences. There are important differences. And I showed this earlier to a class, but there's an important reason why I show this slide. So here we have biology, right? Look, there's the body, you see the ligaments, muscles, mammary tissue, bones, all that stuff. Totally cool. This is just all about biology, right? No, this is a gendered picture. Here's a traditional gendered female, here's a traditional gendered male. My point is, there's no nature nurture. You can't extract one from the other. We can't ever see bodies without gendering them, no matter how much we talk about biology. But let's talk about biology. So here's an important one, XX versus XY. Generally, this is female and this is male. That's our good biological definition. But most of you don't ask for saliva to check someone's DNA before you decide whether they're male or female. So let's pass on that. Mature reproductive function, females give birth and lactate. Males don't. Period. End of story. Okay? That is really not going to change. Those are differences. They're really important differences. Okay? There are differences. Male upper body strength. Males have higher muscle density and greater upper body strength on average from females, although females can train to radically increase their upper body strength just as males can. Males are on average larger than females in any given human population, and then males grow for a longer time period than females. Okay? These are biological differences. These are differences. I was starting out with saying we're not that different. Here are some differences. I'm not trying to say we're all the same. Okay, but there's a lot of overlap. And this is what we never talk about. So here's this famous, not here a little aside. Does anyone know what this image is from? Voyager. So we put, back in the 70s, we threw some things out into space in hopes some aliens will find them. And this is the plaque representing humans.
Great.
Yeah, we could talk about this all day, as this is the representation of humans. The second thing is, didn't they even ask an anthropologist, in many societies, putting your hand up like this is not friendly sign. It's like, back off! What are these weird-looking things? Let me also point out that this is not what the majority of humans look like on the planet at all. Anyways, but let's leave that for a discussion. What we see very common is that women, on average, are smaller than men. That's a species typical pattern, 10 to 15% usually. What we don't talk about is the overlap, right? So if you actually then map all the range of distribution of males and females, you see that there's 78% overlap. So two randomly selected individuals from the same population are going to overlap 78% of the time. Okay, between males and females. Everyone got that? That's actually really a different way of thinking about it. And I'm not going to do that because we don't have enough time, but I usually make, when I'm giving this lecture in class, I make my students stand up, and I get 5 men and 5 women, and I line them up. And it's almost always, it depends on how many members of the Notre Dame basketball team are in my class. It almost works out. One time I had 3 members of the female basketball team. It made all the guys in my class feel really bad. But the bottom line is that there's huge overlap, even in this one thing that we know is really different. Okay? So it's how we talk about it. Yes, males on average are taller than females, but there's 78% overlap. All right, there's other stuff too, like, you can tell crania apart, the skulls, you can tell the pelvic girdle apart, and I mentioned this to the class earlier today. Here's a really interesting thing. The female pelvis is wider than the male pelvis, which leads to a slight difference in sort of side-to-side displacement and walk. It's not energetically different, but it gives us this little bit of wiggle, right, which we characterize females. So which group of humans has those sort of really most massive wiggle there in the walk? Yeah, that's from the class this afternoon. Drag queens, because they're men with some male anatomy trying to replicate and exaggerate a female walk. Right? That's gender, ladies and gentlemen. All right. There's also these really interesting patterns of fat, right? Fat pattern differentiation is different. Males and females do that. So there's biological differences. There are some important patterns. We also tend to think a lot about brain differences. I'll give you guys a minute. Okay, everybody, ha ha ha. Right. Now, well, you all laugh at this. You all laugh at this, just like the Yao Ming and the tall Asian guy and short black guy. You guys laugh at this because this fits in with our gender stereotypes. Oh, it's not really this way, but you didn't need this to be explained to you. It's because it's our gender norms. Now, what's the problem with this? We all assume, and every one of you does too, that there's real, and not this extreme, but there are differences between male and female brains, right? Structures. Okay, fine. Here's a brain. Is this male or female? The best neurobiologist on the planet can't tell you. There are no structural differences between male and female brains. Let me repeat that. There are no structural differences between male and female. There's a couple debates on a few things, but it's very hard to replicate any of them, right? However, so size doesn't matter because male brains are slightly larger than female brains, right? Because why? Yeah, males are larger than females on average. But the male brains grow a little bit longer because they're bigger. And there's a couple debated structural differences that none of them have been replicated. So there's no demonstrated functional differences or structural differences. However, function is a little bit different. If you take 2 adults, males and females, right, and you put them in MRI or other ways to assess brain function, it looks like the same structures are doing slightly different things. Okay. Here's composite brains from a study of 60 males and 60 females. The age of 13 years of age, 13 to 17, and 17 to 22. Female here on your left, male on your right for each of these categories. Now I want you to take a look at here, and here, and here. I will point out, these are just referencing electrical activity. There is no statistical difference between female and male in this cohort. There's a slight pattern of difference here. It actually looks like more than it is statistically when you run the analysis. There is a statistically significant difference between the 20-year-old males and females. So, what you're looking at is called gender. We embody it. Gender becomes biology. Our brains begin to function differently with the same structures because of the life experiences that we have. And males and females are exposed to different expectations, behaviors, and it makes our brains different. Our brains are not different by structure. They're different by experience. But get rid of the nature-nurture. It's not either. It's both, right? We're measuring the gendered world as it shapes our biology. All right. So, well, maybe men and women aren't really wired different. It's just this sort of cultural stuff that happens, right? But humans are really different. So, I mean, if we look at males and females, like the behavior has to be radically different, right? Okay, here's height, right? That 78% overlap that we know is one of the biggest differences. Here's a compilation of 128 psychological measures from 5,000 studies and over 100,000 individuals. This is what human behavioral variation between males and females looks like. About 92% over there. Men and women, on average, do the same stuff. Dramatically. Okay, what about aggression and violence? I just had to throw this in there because we talked about aggression and violence and I have 4 minutes. Okay, physical and verbal aggression. Well, we all know this, right? Men are more aggressive than females, usually. Situational context and age varies a lot. Anger, males and females show almost identical rates of anger. A lot of variation in individuals. This is when you're comparing males and females. Indirect aggression, females have greater indirect aggression than males, but only in certain age groups. And indirect aggression is when you use a third party to, or sort of don't directly use physical aggression. All aggression in couples, males are equal to females. That is physical aggression. Physical aggression in couples, females exhibit more frequent physical aggression than males, but males exhibit more injurious aggression than females. Okay. So the differences, they're not clean and they're not simple, right? That's really important. What about sex? You gotta throw sex in there. I mentioned that in the title, right? So you gotta have some sex. Males report, and I put this in quotes, report higher sex interest, and males report higher sex partner preferences. There are countless studies of these things. But what's really, really interesting, if you go back and you analyze the actual data used by these reports, usually they produce mean numbers. So you ask, how many partners would you like, or how many partners have you had? And men end up over here, and women end up about here, right? But if you take the median, there's no difference between a mean and a median.
Yes.
The median is actually the middle of the real distribution. If you take the median on one of the largest data sets used for this question, males and females show up statistically the same. Well, that's how you do it. The mean gets all the lines. So in the mean, many males, and these are mostly college students, well, how many have you had sex with? The guys are like, 50, 70, 100. And the women lie in the other direction.
We like the other direction.
So, actual sexual activity, it is hard to study this, almost always is about near equal, and the actual number of partners preferred and actually engaged in is almost always equal. So actually sex, even though there's huge assumptions about what men do and what women do, it actually is almost identical, right? And this is in heterosexual couples, right? Homosexuality is slightly different, the patterns are slightly different there. This is heterosexual couples. So, why should this not be surprising for anyone who likes math? It takes 2 to tango. Who's having sex? You get these populations where the guy's like, oh, we're having sex all over the place. And the women say, oh, we're not having sex at all. Wait a minute. All right. So there's obviously some important differences, but the similarities are really, really prevalent and important. But we just don't focus on those. We always focus on the differences. Why? Well, we have some assumptions about what the world is like. We assume that guys are protectors, hunters, stone tool makers, and artists. Right? And that the women adore that. Right? This is what we assume, and then we take that assumption and we use gender, this sort of cultural context, to reinforce it. Right? So how do we do that? How does gender happen? Right? Gender becomes biology and behavior. So gender is all about becoming human. We know gender. Every society has gender. Now, different societies do it in different ways, but let's talk about ours. The Gina Davis Institute at the Annenberg School at USC every year does this big overview of representation in popular media, particularly Hollywood films. Here's just a slice of that from recent work on G and PG-rated films, the ones that children are most likely to see. Comparing males and female roles, females are shown 4 times as much in sexy clothing, always nude, basically, compared to men, or partially nude, thin and attractive. I should also point out that 80% of the speaking roles in these films are male, 20% are female. We all know males talk just so much more than females. And almost all of the income-earning roles in these films are by males, not females. How do we build gender? This is one of the ways. Let me give you one other way. All right, so here's Posh Spice, Mrs. Beckham, throwing a baseball like a girl, right? You guys heard this phrase before? All right. Well, it turns out that she is not throwing like a girl. That is a gendered statement. She is throwing like a human being. If you are a human being and you're given an object, I'm going to see, hopefully this will here. I'm going to throw my mitts. If you're given an object, and your requirement is to pick up that object and throw it, anatomically, here's how you do it. No, that's on purpose. The reason I can throw it like that is because the way your body works is to pick something up and launch it this way. That's anatomically correct. To throw a baseball, you have to wrench your body into a wide variety of horribly uncomfortable positions. And we know that because long-term baseball players have horrible elbow and shoulder injuries. So this is not throwing like a girl. Girls can be trained to throw very much like this. This is throwing like a human. And yet, we engender the very basic function of human anatomy and give it a name and create a negative connotation. So we have this negative association with normative human throwing unless you've been trained like a guy. Okay, so men and women are really, really different. No. That's busted. All right. So what do we know? We know that humans are not more naturally aggressive and violent than peaceful and egalitarian. We know that men and women are not nearly as different as one might think. And we know that even though humans are all one race, racism matters. We know these things. I could sit here for another, as I said, 6 to 9 years, telling you, demonstrating this, study after study, scholarly article after scholarly article, elaborate on all of these themes and support them. So what? What does that matter? What can we do about this? The data are there. We've known this stuff for a long time. We keep knowing it more, right? But that doesn't seem to be helping. What can we do? All right, I'm an instructor, professor, member of the faculty, so I'm going to do what I do all the time. I'm going to give you some homework for the rest of your life. Here's what we can do about it. Think. Combat ignorance. Actually inquire about these things that seem to be common sense, but maybe don't rub you the right way. Maybe you realize that this is not right. And now after this, or after having access to this kind of information, or maybe you already knew this, but ignore it. You've got to think about this. So we need to really think about this kind of context. We also need to talk about it. And I'm going to use an example of race. Race is one of the most difficult things to talk about in our society. But if I have to wake up one more morning to a television image of a young black man being shot by a police officer without being able to talk about the infrastructural problems in our society caused by racism, inequality, and history, I'm going to be very, very upset. So you guys have to all fix that. The bottom line is that if we don't talk about race, if we don't talk about what we know about gender and aggression, it's going to maintain itself and it's going to keep going on. We have knowledge, we have the ability to talk about it, and we have to not be afraid, because it's really uncomfortable to talk about. Tough. Get over it. Life is hard. Talk about it. And finally, don't let your friends or your family or your acquaintances get away with lying. When people say something that you know is not true, when someone says something that is racist, incorrectly sexist or genderist, or makes an assertion about what humans are really like, and you know that's not the case, do it politely, but call them. Don't let them get away with it. If people just did that every now and then, in public, around the dinner table, and in private, our lives, our ability to make change in this society, which is a great society, but it's really messed up, would be a little bit better. We need to do everything we can to create a better society. Thank you very much. So I have a whole other thing to mention in the back, so don't worry about that. Hormones. So, here's a whole, sorry, we should have given the whole hormone talk, right? There's another one. So, how many of you have testosterone?
We all do.
Everyone has testosterone. Males have slightly higher resting levels of testosterone than females, sometimes very much higher resting levels. Sometimes females have very high resting levels. How many of you have progesterone? All of us. How many of you have estrogen?
All of us.
All of us. What does testosterone have to be turned into before it functions in some regions of the brain?
Estrogen.
Estrogen. So anyways, There are some really important variation in endocrine patterns in humans, but there's no single hormone that's characteristic of females. And aside from the sort of the luteal cycle, the sort of reproductive cycle, there aren't these sort of patterns. And human males also have a cycle. Females have menopause. It's actually a male andropause as well. So the differences are actually much smaller than people think. There are some important ones. But it is not true that men are running around testosterone-laden beasts when female are. There are many testosterone-laden females as well.
Just back to the hormones. Agreed that it's a slight difference, but it does have an effect on the body.
Yeah.
I mean, if you change the hormones, you can
Yep.
also change the body,
So-
even though they're biologically equal.
Yeah, so I mean, there's some really interesting patterns, but there's a lot of things we assume about hormones. So, for example, we know, and I remember this personally as a pubescent male. At that point, like something weird goes on, right? And you grow, and you're like, what's all this stuff? It happens to women too at the same time, but with men, it's highly associated with a real ratcheting up of testosterone, right? You know something really interesting? There was absolutely no correlation between increased aggression and that gigantic testosterone-flooded puberty. None. So, yes, testosterone is important, but testosterone is not what you guys think it is. It's a great book by Robert Sapolsky at Stanford, called The Trouble with Testosterone. I suggest people read it, because we know a lot about endocrine, about hormone function, but we have a whole bunch of assumptions about testosterone, estrogen, estradiol, and all these things that are actually not what we think they are. Testosterone is incredibly important for both men and women, and it's incredibly important in parenting, as is progesterone. And they have a very interesting relationship in men and women. So, this is a cool sort of story. My colleague Lee Gettler at University of Notre Dame has shown some really interesting things that we know the physiology of females. That is, if you take a female and sort of rub an infant on her, newborn, whatever, you can get some sort of result. You can get some sort of physiological responses. Put a man at parturition, at birth, in that room, give him that infant. You know what? Exact same hormone system. Humans are adapted to unbelievable levels of caretaking, both male and female, and that's related to testosterone and progesterone.
Use the mic.
Sure.
You've mentioned Sapolsky, and he has a lecture, The Uniqueness of Humans, and I've watched it about 50 times. But in the end, it's about the baboon fruit that is very violent, and then the aggressive males
All die.
and then there's 2 to 1 of females to males. But the females teach the males to social groom, and then any male that enters that troop is then also taught to social groom. So is that sort of violence that is in our society, say, men tend to be the killers, or et cetera, is that all learned, or would you say
No.
it's...
No, I mean, how we kill is learned. The capacity for aggression is not. That's inherent. So we have an incredible capacity for aggression, but individual aggression is fairly rare. That is, what happens if someone is just way off their rocker with aggression in our society or any society? Same thing that happens in a baboon society. They get kicked out. They get kicked out. So individuals aren't. So we have a great capacity for organized violence. What was fascinating about Bob Sapolsky's thing, and baboons are a little different from humans in some ways. They're a little bit more limited in their range of expression. What was fascinating is that everyone always assumed that male baboons are dominant and violent. Well, this event happened, and these big, really, really mean male baboons all actually kept everyone else away from this meat at this tourist dump. Turned out the meat was contaminated with TB, and they all died. So the remaining males were these sort of weaker males who were mellow, and they're like, oh, look, we're now the males in the group. And so they got on with the females, and so they changed the culture of the group. So that's a very simplified thing, and in humans it's much more complicated. However, there's a lesson to be learned there. Behavior, aggression, caring, compassion, none of this stuff is genetically determined. It grows, it's nurtured, it's engaged. And so thinking about that is really important. And Bob Sapolsky has a great beard. Another thing associated with testosterone.
I just wanted to ask, is it still true what psychologists say about the old ancient limbic brain and how we think of the other, and so therefore, oh, I don't like you because you're different. So we need to think and talk and analyze because we're not good at it. But is that still in play?
I should have mentioned this. It's really, so this whole idea that humans are naturally xenophobic, right? That the other challenges us because they're going to attack us or fight with us. It turns out fighting with other groups was probably as important or maybe not as important as cooperating with other groups in human evolution. So, if you look at the physiology of humans, let's take infants, right? So infants can differentiate faces really, really quickly. They can really differentiate who they know, who's like familiar to them and who's not, and they respond to that differently. So people have extended that into this, oh, well, us and them when we fight and you're hating. It turns out that kids don't have that until about 5 to 7 years of age. Like you take a kid, you guys have been around kids, take a kid and start saying, I mean, there's individual variation, but most kids have no compunction walking up to someone like, hey, wait, no, what's that? Then that filter is acquired. Nelson Mandela, who was a fairly insightful individual, said that we are not born hating, but we're very good at teaching hating. And physiologically, that's true. We don't have an automatic response just because someone is different. We have a response because of the way in which our system has been trained to recognize the other. And that's actually a big difference in there. So there is not a natural xenophobic, hating the foreigners, but there is an acquired us and them context in there. But we do have a strong response to danger. And so what we're told is dangerous, we respond to. Yeah. Any other questions? I wiped you guys out.
Have you thought about how the conflict in the Middle East is going to end?
Did think you'd ask me an easy one? So here's one of the most important things when we talk about global conflicts and national conflicts is obviously we're in a mess in a lot of places. One of the biggest problems with resolving conflicts is that we have such structured social, political, and economic inequalities in our world today that those are almost going to guarantee us continued conflict. However, understanding differences and understanding histories is really important to ameliorating those conflicts. So things like restorative justice and moving past understanding just why people are fighting towards trying to figure out how they can get along, I think is extremely important. The situation in the Middle East, to even get a grasp of it, you have to understand history, politics, economics, a little bit about religion, but much less than you think. To really, and a lot about ethnicity and linguistic historical context. So, is that going to end? Are people ever going to all run around holding hands in daisies in fields? No. People will always fight. People will always do bad things, violent and cruel things. But those things are going to be greatly outweighed, and are, even today in the West Bank or many other places, every place where there's horrendous things going on a daily basis, you step back and ask what happens in people's lives. There's some really interesting studies during the destruction of the breakup of Yugoslavia, the wars in Croatia and Bosnia. In the midst of horrendous civil war, where incredible atrocities are being committed, people woke up, people kissed the ones they loved, people made breakfast, people helped each other, people actually got together to do things, even under the most incredible stress. And so that kind of thing gives me hope that we can move forward. But the problem is we have to get our political leaders to actually stop trying to mess with each other. Think about this. That's not easy.
I'm fine, I don't need a microphone. Okay. I'm for that. So growing up 100 years ago, we had options, black, white, other. I was one of the people in the middle and grew up with a largely, completely predominantly white, so the only minority child. And I remember this discussion of African, it was Negroid, Mongoloid, those words, right? But it was anthropologically based, right?
Yep. Oh yeah, I take full credit for us, the anthropologists who really started this mess up.
Fair enough, but the interesting thing that we were taught, and again, public school system, the whole thing, was that there were specific physiological differences, right. Skull differences, in the Asian skull versus in the sort of Western Europe. That's all gone now. Is that
so, well, remember I showed you that thing? If I took a cranium of populations in Beijing and a cranium of populations in London, yeah, I'm going to show you some really clear differences. What about if I took every population in between there and then said, where's the dividing line? There isn't one. So the further you are away, different. So let me give you an example. I can tell in the United States, if you're well trained in forensic analysis, you can take what we're going to call a black skull and a white skull. There's actually two versions of the white skull in the U.S. that we divide up into. So you take a black skull and white skull, and 76% of the time, 80% of the time, say this was a black person, this was a white person, right? Because of historical reasons. It's not the genes, there's other things going on. But wait, we can also take a white population from New England today, and a white population from New England in the 1870s, and they're as easy to tell apart as a black and a white skull. Are those two different races? But wait, don't order yet. You can go to Japan and take a cranium from Tokyo and a cranium from Kyoto, and they're as easy to tell apart as black and white are here today. It turns out, Franz Boas showed this a long time ago, cranial morphology, like the way your skull is shaped and changes, actually is highly malleable to local environments. So clusters of individuals sharing the same environment, the same nutrition, same context, are going to actually share some morphological similarities. It doesn't mean that these are biological groups.
It's funny you made that hand movement because a lot of the people in our culture do that with their babies to make their heads pretty.
Yeah. Oh, and people, and also you can do all sorts of stuff
Weird
with.
that you did that right when you were talking about
So,
it.
but many societies, I mean, there are many societies that stick a kid on this board and like strap him in and give him this flat head. There's many societies that make cone head. I mean, you can actually manipulate like infants' heads. Remember that all these plates aren't sealed, right? For a while. When you come out, anyone ever seen an infant when they come out and they never show it to the mom right away? Ah, my kid's a cone head. But there's a lot of malleability, and none of it results in brain damage. So actually, all of the shape in the skull, most of that has nothing to do with effective being human. Even though we make such a deal about skin and about face. And those are two things that are probably the least important in most contexts, biologically.
So, what was it, 40,000 years ago, what was it, where things started to change?
So at least where archaeologically we can see more evidence of organized violence. Yeah, about 14,000 years ago. Jebel Sabah is about 14,500 years ago, and it's the first site where we got pretty good evidence of a large-scale violent occurrence.
And is that
It had probably happened before that.
because numbers? Is it basically a numbers game?
Well, a lot of people think it's a numbers game. It's also when people started to settle down in really prime areas, and Jebel Sabah, this area was in northern Sudan, just below Egypt there, right near the Nile. And it was a really, really rich area when all the climatological, sort of the different environments around that were really, not good, getting drier and drier. And these people had a really great place, and we think it was conflict over resources and inequality. And this is what we see when we see in the archaeological record, when we see lots of storage of goods, and we see burials that some have a lot of stuff, some have very little stuff. That also coincides with some serious aggression in the archaeological record. Prior to that, I'm not saying people didn't hit each other over the head and fight and do horrible things, but they didn't do so as regular, structured parts and as organized violence. I mean, that should be taught. It's fascinating what's going on, and then we really need to study that to understand where organized aggression comes from. Again, it doesn't mean that people didn't get in fights and punch each other in the face.
Is race phenotypic? Is that what basically just a phenotype?
Well, race, I mean, the way we use race is not about biology. It's about classifying people. So we in this society have just weird concepts. I won't talk about how we build race. Like we have this weird one drop rule, right? So you're legally African American if you're by that rule, if you really think about it, we're all black. Because everyone has a majority of African, gene sequences in their body. So, but that would make that checking off those lists really difficult. So I mean, the short answer is that race is real, but it's not real the way you think it is. It's real because we make it real as a society, and it's changed. It's changed. Go back 100 years, and the Irish weren't white. I wasn't allowed in the country. Coming over from Spain, they're like, no, you guys are a bunch of leftists, radicalists, communists. That was pre-communist. We were anarchists then. Italians, right? So what the loss of white today, very different picture than it was 100 years ago. Right? I was just in South Africa for a week-long workshop and series of lectures, and they're undergoing some radical change there on perception, sense of self, and how they classify people. Classification changes, but it's real and it matters, and it's our responsibility to do something about it. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about intellect, and that there's,
IQ.
For me, there's a bell curve idea also. And the reason I think in the New York Times last year, there was a whole thing around like Nigerian people, Asian people, and Jewish people.
Right.
Why are they so smart or something?
Yes.
And like, so where is all? I mean, the bell curve is
So-
something that you could say, okay, that's terrible, but then you have like this.
I'm not saying, no, I wouldn't say the bell curve is terrible. I would say it's actually lying, and it's bad science. None of the science holds up. I'm not critiquing it because I disagree with it. I'm critiquing it because it's wrong. So there's no association biologically, neurologically, or endocrinologically, or physically between sort of IQ and the things we call races. There are test score differences, though. Right? So there are test score differences that have been changing radically globally. So with test score differences, I just showed you how gender can become the body. Racism is embodied. So there's also poverty differences, right, and economic inequality. So there is huge variation in different ways in which people have capacity to do math, think about things, and do different stuff, but it doesn't vary by race. But those test scores do vary by race. Just like I showed you, why is it that African Americans have twice the infant mortality that whites do in the US? Part of it has to do with that other point that I showed you, that they are regularly discriminated against in hospital visits. Not because of some biological difference in their capacities. So, I mean, the bottom line is there was no native or biological or natural difference in intelligence that forms by races, but there's huge differences in standardized test performance and capacity to do well in testing context based on life experience. And it's true, and it's real. Right? We know that, in fact, females, while they're pregnant, the kinds of nutritional and external stressors that they have can actually translate to differential growth patterns and developmental trajectories for their infants. So women exposed to extreme racism during pregnancy, those kinds of stresses actually lead to developmental slowdowns and other issues for their infants and for the children of those infants. Yeah, it's messed up. Yeah.
Dr. Fuentes,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about what you did when you went to Ferguson recently?
In St. Louis. Just talking about, I mean, we had the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, we actually had a panel on sort of what should, the lecture I gave too. So I was, this is before the Physical Anthro Meetings Association. I gave a public lecture just nearby, just up the road from Ferguson in a very affluent, majority white community, where I gave a much more sort of in-depth lecture on race to sort of talk about, to lay this out. And the reception was quite strong, powerfully supportive. But the level of confusion and misunderstanding of structural realities and the ways in which different people of different races in the United States actually experience day-to-day life in the United States were absolutely pronounced. So one thing, it's easy to come up here and say, okay, well, race is not biology. The much harder thing is to say, okay, but it's still real, and here are all these differences. Why are these differences here? Why do, when asked in polls, why do the different races have totally different, honest, real, honest, different opinions about racism in the United States? Many people say, oh, it's not that bad. And other people say, oh, it's horrible. They're both right from their own perspective. What we need to do is get that global perspective and offer to everyone the kinds of experiences from across the board so that we can move forward with an honest understanding. That's that whole talking about it that's important. You have to empower people to talk about it, no matter how uncomfortable it is.
I'm curious as to how this ties in with your other idea as to Darwin's natural selection and adaptation to the environment, to the degree that you suggested that we change our environments to meet our needs.
Yeah.
So how does this understanding tie into that other major thesis of yours?
So a lot of my work is on human evolution, and sort of the premise is that we are the species that had a hand in making ourselves. We do something called, many organisms do something called niche construction. That's when the environment challenges them, they respond, and in responding they change the environment. Beavers, for example, right? Beavers enter a landscape and they got this nice creek and whatever, so they mess it all up with a dam. But that changes the water temperature, it changes some of the animals around, but it makes it much better for the beavers. So we do that on a slightly larger scale. So what's interesting is that humans interacting with these pressures on them change those pressures. And so human evolution and trying to understand why we are the way we are is much more complicated because social thought and perception actually can have real biological and evolutionarily relevant action, right, impacts. So the way we mess with our environment can actually affect us. So one of the most terrifying things that has come out recently from this study is in the wide range of epigenetics, this idea that influences, like I just mentioned to you on, for example, a pregnant female can have really significant downstream effects, not only to her children, but to her children's children. We now know that malnutrition, psychological stress, right, and a few other kinds of stressors in a mom while pregnant can, not always, but can influence the way in which that infant develops such that there's a triggering of many physiological systems in that infant so that that infant's children, and maybe that infant's children's children, have challenges in the sense of brain development, in the sense of digestive anatomy, and which predisposing them towards obesity and a variety of other things. So we know the cultural inequality that is real in our society actually damages the biology of people for generations. And we have to deal with that. And that's very hard to deal with, because unless you change all of that. So the way humans think about the world actually impacts the way the world is and affects our bodies.
One thing that humans do, and I think
it's all races and all people, is that we have a perspective that we develop. And then we're very judgmental in the sense that we see somebody immediately and we categorize.
Right.
And there's reasons for that.
Yep.
That sometimes there's good reasons and bad reasons. Now, most of the time it works. You know, you see somebody, and through your experiences, always I made the right decision. But then there's other times it doesn't work at all, and this is part of the problem with human conflicts.
Yeah. So I think this is really, we do categorize all the time, but why we categorize and how we categorize. And I showed you this picture of these kids from New Guinea, and we're like, well, they're black Africans, right? Because we didn't recognize that dark skin, broad noses, and curly hair are actually widespread in many places, and in fact not typical by any extent of all African populations. So part of that is knowing how to categorize. But
in very small populations.
yeah. Oh yeah, no. Humans categorize. We love to put stuff in boxes. Right? That's why I use that joke, the old Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other. We do that all the time. Humans do that. And actually, it's pretty good, because categorizing the world around us helps us navigate it. Right? It gives us shorthand. We don't have to think every day about, okay, I'm waking up. Who am I? What am I doing? You know, like, if we have to actually go through all the stuff that we think about, brushing your teeth, and then we'll be okay, what is that? What? So categorization helps us a lot, but it can also be, if it's based on these societal myths, it can also be very, very damaging. So the whole notion of categorizing people into black, white, and Asian, or simply into male and female, it's actually problematic because of the baggage we have with those categories. So once we look at one person, we just assume that's what they are. And that's sort of weird, because if anything, look around the room. If we know anything, humans are ridiculously diverse. Even though our genetic variation is so homogeneous, our bodies, our experiences, our minds, and our capacities are really, really variable. That's a good thing. It's good to have variation, particularly from an evolutionary sense. One of the reasons we're so successful is because we're so adaptable. And what do we have? I mean, how did we go? 2 million years ago, if you looked at our ancestors, they were like this tall, they were naked, they had no fangs, they had no claws, they had no horns, right? Maybe a stick, right? And everything out there was this big with big teeth and wanted to eat them. No claws, no fangs, no rocks, really aside from a little one. What did they have? They had each other. This was even before the brains got big. They had each other, and they had cooperation and collaboration. And that should be a very strong message of optimism to us. Think about everything that has been successful in your life. And think about the collaborations and cooperation that's been behind it. And so even though we divide people, we have the ability to change how we divide them. We're not going to stop dividing people, right? Like people say, oh, will racism be over? No. It's not going to go away. But we can make it much less negative.
You were talking about the collaboration. It's a good segue. I know time is a little short, but I think it's very, very important. Just talk a little bit about what you were saying at lunch about the attractiveness of ISIS and ISIL. I think it's very important to talk about that.
This is unpublished research that's going to be coming out that's done by a wonderful researcher at the University of Michigan and also at Cambridge and Oxford, Scott Atrin. He has a couple there's at least one editorial in the New York Times on this, and the research, we'll be publishing some of the research with him soon. It's mind-blowing, or mind-numbing to try to figure out why young men go from around the world, let's say Minneapolis, Toledo, Toronto, London, and they go to join the Islamic State, or ISIS, or ISIL, or whatever you want to call it, and they go and they commit horrible atrocities and acts of violence, beheading fellow humans and slaughtering thousands. The initial results from talking to these young men, from figuring out what's going on, show us some interesting patterns. One, they are young men and women who have grown up completely detached from their family, from their society, from community. Two, they're individuals who feel disaffected but find affection and community in online contexts. They are given meaning by this incredibly simplistic yet very bonding ideology that the Islamic State is putting out. When you talk to these young men, they know nothing about Islamic theology. They know a few things that they're told, but they share those in common with a small group of friends whom they're incredibly tightly bound, for whom they will die. Community, comradeship, in this incredibly cruel and horrendous context relies on something that they're missing in their lives. And those things are problematic because we are in states and nations and societies where we've allowed whole swaths of young men and women to grow up without roots, without connections, without anchors, and without hope. And the Islamic State gives them hope of camaraderie and hope for something in the afterlife that is so much better than what they have now. So this is interesting. This is the use of this unbelievable human ability and desire, need to be with others, perverted and turned around to an atrocious, violent, cruel action. And we know that's there, and we know why it's there, and we know what these young men and women's lives are like. So how do we fix this? I mean, you can keep attacking ISIL, and we will, but the real change has to be in the societies where these young men come. That's a depressing way to end.
Next question. Oh, next question. It's just interesting to hear you say that because that's the same definition that was given for gangs in America.
So, this is exactly, and there's some real similarities there, but there's some important differences because this was given for gangs in America in many cases, particularly Latino and African American young men and their sort of involvement in these things. However, there's a more complex nature to the communities in which they come from and the way it was laid out. So there's much more optimism in the United States for dealing with gang violence and dealing with infrastructure. Even though some of the things are similar, it's not as dire. It's not as dire, and we've seen wonderful programs in Los Angeles, for example. There's an amazing programs that show the building of community within communities that are disenfranchised, that are impoverished, that there is this capacity to build community, and that we haven't lost all of that yet. So I think there's much more hope, particularly in communities of color in the United States that have been disenfranchised. It's a horrible problem for our society, but this ISIL is even larger and it's political. But some of the same strategies that work there are the ones that they're trying to do now in London and in Toronto to work with these young men. And women. Actually, they're doing it with young men, they're not doing it with young women. There are almost no programs to help these young women who are increasingly disappearing and going to join us. So, let me end with this. I gave you some homework, right? I'm reminding you now. And I'm joking about that, but I'm sort of not. The point is that this information is out there. Don't buy what I say. You don't have to believe me. I don't want you to believe me. I want you to understand me and to think about how you might go out and find out this information on your own. Look around, see the way people talk about things, see what information is out there, make up your own minds, and when you do that, do something about it. Don't let these myths continue. Thank you very much.
So we have announcements.